Doctors told Marcus Kane that the 12-year-old wouldn't survive the night. 3 fractured ribs, internal bleeding skull fractures severe enough that brain swelling remained a constant threat. All because a homeless child nobody knew existed had thrown himself between armed kidnappers and their target, a 6-year-old girl named Emma Kane, who'd been feeding ducks at Memorial Park, when 2 men decided her life was worth less than whatever ransom they'd planned to collect. The police called Liam Bennett's actions heroic, reckless, statistically impossible. But they didn't understand what the boy had known in those final seconds before consciousness abandoned him. The leather vest Emma's father wore, the patches reading Iron Wolves MC President. Liam had saved a biker's daughter. And in 48 hours, 300 riders would arrive to pay a debt that would reconstruct everything the child thought he understood about what family meant. Most people never noticed the spaces between things. The gap beneath Henderson Bridge where concrete met riverbank. The shadow behind dumpsters and alleys that smelled like rotting produce and broken dreams. The corner of Memorial Park where streetlights didn't quite reach and bench slats had been worn smooth by decades of bodies seeking momentary rest. Liam Bennett had learned to inhabit those spaces with the expertise of someone whose survival depended on remaining unseen. At 12 years old, he'd become a ghost occupying the margins of Portland's daily rhythm, invisible by necessity rather than choice. His home sat tucked beneath Henderson Bridge on the east side where the Willamette River carved its path through the city and carried secrets nobody wanted to acknowledge. A flattened cardboard box served as mattress. The blue tarp he'd salvaged behind Morrison's hardware store 3 months back kept rain from destroying what little he possessed. 3 plastic grocery bags contained everything: 2 changes of clothes that no longer fit properly, a winter coat whose zipper had broken, a November toothbrush and paste stolen from a gas station bathroom water bottle, with a crack along one side that leaked a fill too high, and the notebook with its pen clipped to the spiral binding. That notebook mattered more than any other possession. It kept him sharp, kept him observant, kept him alive in ways that food and shelter couldn't match. The only creature who acknowledged Liam's existence was Scout, a rust-colored mutt with one ear that stood crooked and ribs visible beneath matted fur, despite Liam's best efforts to feed him properly. He'd found the dog 4 months back, or maybe Scout had found him. The distinction seemed irrelevant when 2 desperate creatures recognized kinship in each other's eyes. They'd been inseparable since the dog sleeping curled against Liam's side, every night sharing warmth and loneliness, and the strange comfort that came from not being completely alone, even when the world had forgotten you existed. Every morning followed patterns Liam had perfected through trial and error. Wake before dawn when the air still held night's chill, and fewer people occupied streets to question why a child moved through darkness without adult supervision. Pack everything into the plastic bags with methodical precision, leaving no trace of habitation beneath the bridge. Walk 2 miles to the shopping district, where restaurants and offices generated steady streams of recyclable bottles worth 5 cents each at the Redemption Center on Burnside. Fill a trash bag systematically, moving from dumpster to dumpster with practiced efficiency. Cash in at the center where the attendant had stopped asking questions months ago and simply counted bottles with mechanical disinterest. Buy day-old bread from the bakery, a can of dog food from the dollar store when funds allowed. Split bread with Scout. Watch him devour canned food like it constituted a feast. Find public restrooms with working faucets. Wash face and hands with soap dispenser mounted on tiled walls. Try to look normal enough that people's eyes would slide past without registering concern or pity. Try to stay invisible. The memories of before arrived in fragments, now 8 months distant, but maintaining edges sharp enough to cut when Liam's defenses weakened. His mother's laugh, the way it had sounded before pills transformed her into someone he didn't recognize. The apartment that had smelled perpetually of vanilla candles she'd loved lighting on Sunday evenings. Then the candles stopped appearing. Then Jennifer Bennett stopped getting out of bed except to chase the numbness that opioids provided. Then the ambulance came with its flashing lights and urgent voices and social workers asking questions Liam couldn't answer because nobody had taught 12-year-olds how to explain why mothers chose chemicals over consciousness, chose escape over the child who needed her present and whole. The foster home had lasted 3 weeks before Liam understood that some systems designed ostensibly to protect actually inflicted damage more profound than streets ever could. The Miller family had taken him in with practiced efficiency that suggested he represented simply another paycheck in a long line of temporary children moving through their home. 5 foster kids total, ranging from ages 6 to 15, all sharing space in a house that smelled like cigarette smoke and resentment. Minimal food appeared at mealtimes, calculated to meet legal requirements without approaching adequacy. Strict rules governed every aspect of daily existence: bathroom schedules, television privileges, outdoor time measured in 15-minute increments. Mr. Miller's temper manifested unpredictably, triggered by infractions Liam couldn't anticipate or avoid. Mrs. Miller's indifference proved somehow worse than anger, her eyes sliding past foster children as though they existed merely as obstacles between her and the check the state deposited monthly. Liam had run after overhearing conversation he wasn't meant to hear. Mr. Miller's voice carrying from the kitchen where he spoke to his wife about the newest placement. Problem kids like this one aren't worth the trouble. System's paying us, but if he causes issues, we send him back. Not worth the headache. The casual dismissal, the reduction of Liam's entire existence to cost-benefit analysis had crystallized something fundamental. Better to be homeless and invisible than housed and worthless. Better to make his own way than depend on adults who viewed him as burden, rather than child deserving basic dignity. Survival on streets had taught Liam lessons no classroom covered. The first week had been terrifying, hunger and cold, and fear forming constant companions. Finding Scout limping through that alley had saved them both, two damaged creatures recognizing mutual need. Together they'd learned routines and safe spots and the techniques required to remain beneath notice. Liam had developed his notebook habit as insurance, documenting threats in patterns and license plates of vehicles that appeared too frequently in locations where children gathered. The cataloging gave him illusion of control in life that had spun wildly beyond his ability to influence outcomes. 3 weeks ago, he'd noticed something that made instincts develop through months of hypervigilance, scream warnings he couldn't articulate, but knew better than to ignore. A white sedan, newer model windows tinted dark enough to obscure occupants. It had circled Memorial Park 3 times while Liam sat on his usual bench, sorting bottles by redemption value. The next week, same car, same slow cruise around the park's perimeter, movements too deliberate to constitute coincidence. This past Monday, it had appeared again, and Liam's pen had moved across notebook pages with meticulous precision. Oregon license plate KLM 8492, dates and times, observations about 2 men inside, who never emerged, but whose attention remained fixed on playground areas where children played under assumptions of safety that Liam knew was illusory at best. Memorial Park had become Liam's sanctuary during daylight hours, positioned 3 blocks from the bridge, with public restrooms that janitors actually cleaned twice daily, water fountains that functioned reliably, and sufficient foot traffic that a quiet boy with a dog didn't attract unwanted attention. The park featured benches worn smooth by decades of use, oak trees providing shade in summer months, and a bronze fountain at the center where children played and parents watched, and life happened the way Liam remembered it occurring before everything had collapsed. He observed this world with the detachment of someone studying a foreign culture through museum glass, yearning buried beneath practical recognition that the normal he'd lost couldn't be reclaimed through wishing. Wednesdays carried rhythms all their own. Around 10 in the morning, Mrs. Halloway would arrive with her canvas bag full of bread scraps destined for pigeons that gathered expectantly. She was perhaps 70, Korean heritage, evident in delicate bone structure and silver hair she maintained in a neat bun, eyes that noticed things most people missed. She fed birds every Wednesday without fail, scattering crumbs in wide arcs while humming songs Liam didn't recognize but found somehow comforting in their consistency. She'd acknowledged his existence the first week he'd started frequenting the park, offering a simple nod and occasionally wrapped carefully in paper napkins, a turkey sandwich, or bag of chips left on the bench beside him when she departed. Liam never thanked her directly because that would break the unspoken agreement they maintained. She didn't treat him like charity case requiring rescue. He didn't make her feel like savior, fulfilling obligation. The arrangement worked precisely because neither party expected more than what was offered. From his usual bench near the western edge, Liam watched families existing in ways that felt increasingly alien. Fathers pushing toddlers on swings, their laughter carrying across grass, still damp from morning dew. Mothers spreading picnic blankets and unpacking lunches from actual Tupperware containers. Abundance that spoke of homes with kitchens and refrigerators and the luxury of planning meals rather than scavenging them. Teenagers throwing frisbees with casual disregard for the miracle of possessing energy to waste on play. Couples holding hands while dogs chased tennis balls, and the world continued spinning on axis that no longer included people like Liam. He watched with fascination born of anthropological distance, studying behaviors he'd once participated in but could no longer access. Every Wednesday at 11:15, like some cosmic clockwork, he'd learned to anticipate the motorcycle arrived. A black and chrome beast that rumbled into the parking lot ridden by a man in his late 30s wearing a leather vest over dark shirt. The vest carried patches colorful and detailed, though Liam had never approached closely enough to read specific text. The man possessed weathered face and strong build, the kind of presence that made people instinctively step aside when he moved through crowds. But when his daughter climbed off the motorcycle's passenger seat helmet, comically oversized for her small head, the man transformed into something gentler. Protective instincts visible in the way he checked her jacket zipper and adjusted her backpack before releasing her to play. Emma, Liam had heard the father call her that once, the name drifting across the park on breeze that carried autumn's chill. She appeared to be 6, maybe 7, with dark curls that bounced when she ran, and laughter that sounded like wind chimes responding to summer storms. Every Wednesday, she brought a paper bag filled with bread, pieces skipping to the fountain, where ducks gathered with expectations formed by routine, and she'd scatter food with unself-conscious joy that reminded Liam of who he'd been before life taught him that joy was luxury the vulnerable couldn't afford. She always brought too much bread, excess floating in fountain water, until maintenance crews cleaned it out. But her father never corrected this generosity, just watched from his parked motorcycle while making phone calls that required concentration, but never enough to lose visual contact with his daughter. Today felt different in ways Liam couldn't initially articulate. The white sedan was back pulling into the parking lot 3 spaces from the motorcycle, and this time it didn't leave. It simply parked, engine idling, 2 shapes visible through tinted windows. Liam's hand moved automatically to his notebook pen, clicking open. Gaze shifting between the sedan and Emma, playing obliviously at the fountain 30 yards away. His pulse quickened as he followed sightlines and understood with certainty what the men were watching. Not the park generally, not the fountain as an architectural feature. Emma, specifically her movements, her isolation from her father, who stood 50 feet away, with phone pressed to his ear, back partially turned, while he dealt with whatever conversation demanded his full attention. Liam's internal voice began its familiar litany of survival wisdom, learned through hard experience. Not your problem. Invisible kids stay invisible by minding their own business. Getting involved means getting noticed, and getting noticed means getting hurt, or worse, getting sent back into a system that had already demonstrated its capacity for institutional cruelty. His fingers tightened on Scout's collar, the dog pressing closer, sensing distress that Liam couldn't hide despite years of practice maintaining emotional equilibrium. But even as his brain calculated risk and recommended the self-preservation that had kept him alive through 8 months of homelessness, something deeper was screaming warnings he couldn't ignore. Marcus Kane's phone call demanded more attention than he'd intended to give, while Emma played within eyesight. The club's attorney was explaining complications with city zoning that threatened the expansion project they'd been planning for 6 months, legal terminology that required concentration to parse properly. Marcus had walked 50 feet from his motorcycle toward the parking lot's edge for better cell reception position that still allowed him to see Emma at the fountain, but created distance he'd regret within minutes. He wasn't neglectful, wasn't careless, was simply a father attempting to balance the demands of running a 300-member motorcycle club with the desire to spend Wednesday mornings watching his daughter feed ducks, because these moments mattered more than any business decision ever could. The sedan's doors opened simultaneously, coordinated movement that spoke of practice and planning. 2 men emerged with casual deliberation designed not to attract attention, appearing simply as adults approaching the fountain for innocent reasons. Derek Walsh moved first, tall and athletic, with baseball cap pulled low enough to shadow features closing distance from Emma's left side, while his partner Brad Miller, shorter and stockier, with jacket inappropriate for the mild weather, approached from her right. They were triangulating, cutting off escape routes. She didn't know she needed closing in on a 6-year-old child who believed the world was fundamentally safe because her father had never given her reason to fear otherwise. Liam watched the pieces align with the same cold clarity that had kept him alive on streets where predators came in forms most people never anticipated. The men's movements were too synchronized, too purposeful, body language broadcasting intention that someone experienced in reading threats couldn't misinterpret. His heart hammered against ribs that would soon be fractured, adrenaline flooding systems that prepared for fight or flight, while his conscious mind still argued for the flight response that had served him well for 8 months. Scout barked once sharp and urgent, the sound cutting through morning air and Liam's paralysis simultaneously. It happened with terrifying speed, the kind of velocity that transformed normal Wednesday morning into nightmare that would haunt everyone present for years. Derek's hand clamped over Emma's mouth before she could process danger or scream for help. Her paper bag dropped, scattering bread across concrete in pattern that looked almost artistic in its chaos. Her small body went rigid with shock that precedes terror, every muscle locking as instinct recognized predator, even if conscious thought couldn't yet comprehend what was happening. Brad grabbed her legs with practiced efficiency, lifting, and together they pivoted toward the sedan, moving quickly now, all pretense of casual behavior abandoned in favor of speed that would transport their target into vehicle before anyone could intervene. Emma's eyes went wide above Derek's palm, pupils dilated with fear that no child should experience, and her muffled cries were barely audible beneath the hand that sealed her mouth. They were dragging her, literally dragging a 6-year-old girl toward a vehicle whose license plate Liam had documented 3 times in his notebook, toward whatever fate awaited children unfortunate enough to be selected by predators who operated in daylight because they understood that witnesses rarely possess courage to become participants in their own rescue narratives. Liam's internal voice reached crescendo pitch, screaming imperatives that contradicted everything experience had taught him. Run. Just run. This isn't your fight. You're 12 years old, 95 pounds, facing 2 grown men who outweigh you by over 100 pounds each. You can't stop them. This isn't your problem. Invisible kids survive by staying invisible, by avoiding situations where good intentions collide with harsh reality and produce only more trauma. Let someone else help. Let the father who's 50 feet away handle this. Let the system that's supposed to protect children do its job. Just run. But his legs weren't listening to survival instincts that had served him well for 8 months. His legs were already moving, carrying him forward, before conscious decision could override the deeper imperative that caring about others, helping those who couldn't help themselves, mattered more than personal safety. Scout's bark became continuous now, the dog understanding that Liam was charging into danger and unable to follow collar held by hand that had suddenly released it. Liam's throat opened, and sound emerged raw and desperate, and impossibly loud for someone who'd spent months making himself small and quiet. The words tore from him as his feet pounded across grass, then pavement, closing the distance between safety and catastrophe, with speed born of absolute certainty that doing nothing would cost something more precious than whatever injury awaited him. His voice carried across the park, cutting through ambient noise of traffic and conversation and normalcy. Hey, leave her alone. The collision, when it came, jarred every bone in Liam's frame, 95 pounds of desperate momentum crashing into Derek Walsh's 220-pound mass, with impact that physics suggested should have been completely ineffective. But surprise counted for something, and the angle Liam had chosen drove his shoulder into Derek's ribs at precise moment when the man's balance was compromised by holding a struggling child. Derek stumbled sideways grip on Emma, loosening just enough that she twisted free, her scream finally breaking through to pierce the morning air with sound that would haunt Marcus Kane for the rest of his life. Emma ran small legs, pumping frantically toward her father, who dropped his phone and started sprinting, the moment her scream registered, face transforming into mask of rage and terror that Marcus would barely remember through the adrenaline that followed. She ran toward safety, toward survival, toward the father who'd been 50 feet away when 50 feet proved to be exactly the distance predators needed to create opportunity. She ran because a homeless boy nobody knew existed had thrown himself between evil and its intended victim without hesitation or calculation of personal cost. Brad Miller's hand closed on Liam's shoulder like a vice constructed of meat and bone, and rage at having their carefully planned abduction disrupted by interfering child who should have known better than to make himself visible. Liam felt himself yanked backward with force that lifted him partially off his feet, body twisted to face Derek, who'd recovered balance and whose expression carried nothing but cold calculation about what happened next to children who complicated operations that were supposed to proceed smoothly. Derek's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, almost bored when he spoke, and somehow that made it more terrifying than if he'd screamed threats. "You just made a big mistake, kid." The first blow caught Liam across the face with enough force that his head snapped sideways, neck muscles straining, and copper taste flooded his mouth immediately as something split inside his cheek. White stars sparked across his vision, pain blooming bright and immediate. But he tried to pull away, tried to create distance, tried to do anything except stand there and absorb what was coming. There was nowhere to go. Brad's grip remained absolute, holding him in place for what followed. The second punch drove into his ribs, and Liam heard something crack inside his chest, with sound like green wood breaking sharp pain that meant something fundamental had broken in ways that wouldn't heal quickly. He couldn't breathe, suddenly couldn't think past the agony radiating from his torso, and his knees buckled, without conscious decision to fall. He hit pavement hard palms, scraping across concrete that embedded gravel into skin, and the pain that had seemed overwhelming intensified as boots connected with his ribs, his back, his legs in methodical assault designed to inflict maximum damage efficiently. Professional. That was the word that would occur to Detective Morrison later when examining injuries. Professional beating delivered by someone who understood human anatomy well enough to know where kicks cause pain without necessarily killing immediately, though internal bleeding remained a very real possibility. Liam curled instinctively, trying to protect his head and stomach and anything vital, arms wrapped around skull, while his body absorbed impacts that would leave bruises lasting for weeks and fractures requiring months to heal properly. Scout was barking, snarling, lunging at the men, but unable to help 70 pounds of desperate canine fury against humans who'd learned long ago that dogs made noise, but rarely posed real threats to adults determined to cause harm. Liam's consciousness began fragmenting, reality breaking into disconnected pieces that his brain couldn't quite assemble into coherent narrative. Pain became everything: pressure where boots connected with flesh, the taste of blood. Emma's screams for her daddy, mixing with other voices, suddenly shouting, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines roaring to life, as Marcus's brothers, who'd been gathering for weekly meetup, realized something terrible was happening. Then the beating stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Liam heard running footsteps, car doors slamming, tires squealing against asphalt, as the sedan fled with Derek and Brad inside their planned abduction, disrupted, but their freedom maintained because getting caught mattered less than completing the job, and completing the job had become impossible the moment one 12-year-old decided that invisible didn't mean powerless. Voices surrounded Liam now, multiple voices shouting commands and questions and expressing concern in tones that registered more as noise than meaningful communication. Someone was checking his pulse, hands gentle, despite their size, voice deep and controlled, even as it carried urgency. "Stay with me, kid. Help's coming. Just stay with me." Liam forced his eyes open through swelling that was already closing them, vision swimming with tears and blood, and the distortion that came with skull fracture he didn't yet know he'd sustained. Above him, a face came into focus slowly, features resolving through the haze. Marcus Kane knelt beside him, leather vest visible even through Liam's failing vision, and the patches were finally close enough to read Iron Wolves MC President. The man's expression held controlled fury, mixed with something that looked like respect or maybe disbelief. Emotions warring across features that had seen violence but perhaps never witnessed courage, quite like what this homeless child had demonstrated. Behind Marcus, Emma stood crying but safe, alive, untouched, except for fear that therapy would eventually help her process. That was what mattered. Liam had bought her those crucial seconds. He'd made himself matter for once, even if the cost was everything. Liam's hand reached out weakly, fingers finding Scout's rust-colored fur where the dog had pressed close, whimpering with distress he couldn't articulate except through sound and proximity. Liam's voice emerged as barely a whisper, blood bubbling at his lips. "Good boy. Protect her." Then darkness rose up and claimed him with mercy that unconsciousness provided, pulling him down into depths where pain couldn't follow, and the question of whether he'd survived the night remained unanswered. Marcus caught something that had fallen from Liam's pocket during the beating, fingers closing around a notebook, whose pages fluttered in breeze that carried October's chill. He opened it automatically, attention divided between the injured child and whatever documentation this object contained, and his breath caught as pages revealed their contents. Sketches filled every available space. License plates documented with dates and times and locations, patterns cataloged with meticulous precision that spoke of mind trained to observe threats others missed. The white sedan's plate number appeared 3 weeks back. First entry dated September 20th. Subsequent appearances tracked with detail that has suggested Liam had recognized something wrong long before today's attempted abduction. This homeless kid hadn't just acted on impulse. He'd been watching, tracking, protecting people without anyone knowing he existed. The notebook contained dozens of other observations, delivery truck schedules, suspicious vehicles, individuals whose presence at the park occurred too frequently to constitute coincidence. Liam Bennett had appointed himself guardian of Memorial Park, using his invisibility to notice what others ignored, documenting evidence that would eventually break open a kidnapping ring operating across the Pacific Northwest. But nobody had known, nobody had seen him. Nobody had cared that a 12-year-old was trying to keep children safe when the systems designed for that purpose had failed so completely that homeless kids represented the last line of defense. Paramedics arrived with equipment in urgent voices, kneeling beside Liam to assess injuries that became more concerning with each measurement they took. Vitals unstable, internal bleeding, suspected based on abdominal rigidity, and blood pressure dropping faster than indicated simple bruising. They worked with efficient speed born of seeing trauma frequently enough that shock had been replaced by practiced competence, starting IV lines and stabilizing neck and loading Liam onto stretcher with movements that looked almost choreographed. Marcus stood back but couldn't leave watching as the child who'd saved his daughter was transported toward ambulance that would rush him to Oregon Medical Center, where surgeons would spend 6 hours repairing damage that should have killed him. Emma clung to Sarah Kane, who'd arrived within minutes of Marcus's frantic phone call, her small body shaking with aftershocks of trauma that hadn't yet processed into conscious understanding of what nearly happened. Her first words were questions that would echo through Marcus's mind for days. "The boy saved me, Daddy. Is he okay?" She refused to release her mother, hypervigilance, making her flinch at sounds and movements that previously wouldn't have registered, but she was alive, breathing safe. Because a child she'd never noticed, who'd been sitting on a bench 30 yards away for weeks while she fed ducks, had chosen action over survival when the moment demanded someone be brave enough to intervene. Detective Ray Morrison arrived as paramedics were loading Liam into the ambulance, his veteran cop's instincts immediately recognizing that this incident contained layers requiring investigation beyond simple assault. He took statements from Marcus from witnesses who'd seen portions of what occurred from other Iron Wolves members who'd been arriving for the weekly gathering when chaos erupted. He examined Liam's notebook with growing recognition of its value-turning pages that documented not just today's attempted abduction, but patterns stretching back weeks. His voice carried professional respect when he spoke to Marcus privately before the ambulance departed. This kid was tracking kidnappers for weeks. He saw the pattern nobody else noticed. This isn't random heroism. This is a child who'd been trying to protect people without anyone knowing he existed. The ambulance departed with lights flashing and sirens wailing, carrying Liam towards surgery that would determine whether courage proved fatal or merely life-altering. Marcus stood in Memorial Park's parking lot holding a blood-stained notebook, watching his daughter cling to his wife, processing emotions that ranged from relief to guilt, to a debt so profound he couldn't yet articulate its full weight. Tank had arrived, the club's sergeant-at-arms, whose road name reflected both his physical presence and his reliability, and his expression asked questions Marcus hadn't yet formulated answers for. Marcus's voice when he spoke carried finality that brooked no argument. "Get the club together. Emergency meeting, tonight. Everyone who can attend." Tank nodded once, understanding that something significant had shifted, that this Wednesday morning had created obligations that required the full Brotherhood to address. He pulled out his phone and began making calls, his voice carrying the authority necessary to convey urgency without explaining details that would be covered at the meeting. Within minutes, messages were cascading through the network that connected 300 riders across Oregon, brief text conveying only essential information. Emergency meeting. Clubhouse. Tonight, mandatory attendance. At Oregon Medical Center, Liam was rushed to surgery with prognosis that made nurses exchange glances that conveyed more than words about his chances of surviving the night. 3 fractured ribs, one of which had caused internal bleeding that required immediate intervention. Skull fracture, severe enough that neurologists were standing by to address brain swelling if it progressed beyond manageable parameters. Extensive bruising, lacerations, and trauma consistent with professional beating delivered by someone who understood human anatomy well enough to cause maximum damage without killing instantly, though delayed death from internal complications remained very real possibility. The hospital identified him as John Doe, initially 12 years old, approximately homeless, based on clothing condition and lack of identification. No family to contact, no emergency contacts, no insurance information, nothing except a dog that animal control had already collected at the scene. The system cataloged him the way it cataloged all the invisible people who cycled through emergency departments. Another statistic, another tragedy, another child the world had failed so completely that strangers proved his only hope for survival. Marcus remained in the hospital corridor outside surgery, pacing with restless energy that suggested a man accustomed to taking action, suddenly forced into passive waiting. He'd called Sarah to confirm Emma was home, and Safe had spoken briefly with Tank to confirm the meeting was organized. But mostly he paced and thought about the child who'd thrown himself at armed kidnappers to save a daughter he'd never met. The debt felt crushing in its weight, profound in its implications, demanding response that Marcus couldn't yet fully articulate, but knew with absolute certainty his club would honor. His phone rang with Detective Morrison's number, and Marcus answered immediately, desperate for information or distraction or anything that provided sense of progress, when everything felt frozen in amber of uncertainty. Morrison's voice carried weight that suggested news more complicated than simple updates about Liam's condition. We ran the sedan's plates, registered to a shell company, but we tracked it back through financial records. Derek Walsh, former Portland PD, forced out 5 years ago for excessive force complaints. It gets worse. He's connected to a string of child abductions across the Pacific Northwest. 7 cases in 3 states, all targeting children of high-value families. Your daughter wasn't random, Marcus. Walsh specializes in planned kidnappings. Someone gave him Emma's information. Marcus's blood ran cold, hand tightening on phone hard enough that plastic creaked beneath his grip. The implications cascaded through his mind with terrible clarity. This hadn't been opportunistic. Crime hadn't been random predator selecting vulnerable target. Emma had been marked research targeted specifically because someone with knowledge of Marcus's family and routines had provided intelligence to professional kidnappers. The question of who possessed both access and motivation to facilitate his daughter's abduction opened possibilities too disturbing to contemplate without evidence. Morrison continued, voice-carrying warning that made Marcus's jaw clench. Walsh has connections. His old captain, Richard Webb, is still on the force. Webb's been blocking investigations, protecting Walsh through channels I'm still mapping out. This goes deeper than street kidnapping, Marcus. This is organized, well-funded, and connected enough to police infrastructure that building a case requires navigating politics carefully. Your club is involved now, whether you wanted to be or not. Walsh knows who disrupted his operation. That homeless kid became a witness, and witnesses who can identify Walsh tend to have short life expectancies. The implications were clear. Helping Liam meant inheriting enemies who operated at levels requiring resources and caution Marcus hadn't anticipated. But walking away meant abandoning a child who'd risked everything for Emma, meant failing the most basic test of character and honor that defined what the Iron Wolves MC supposedly stood for. There was no choice, really. There had never been choice. The debt existed and debts got paid regardless of complications. By 8 that evening, the Iron Wolves clubhouse was packed beyond capacity. 300 members squeezed into a converted warehouse that typically accommodated large gatherings comfortably, but now felt claustrophobic with bodies in tension. Chapters from across Oregon had sent representatives some driving hours to attend an emergency meeting that had been called without explanation. Allied clubs had members present out of solidarity and curiosity, understanding that something significant had occurred to justify this level of mobilization. The air was thick with leather and denim, and the particular energy that came from warriors gathering to address threat requiring collective response. The clubhouse itself reflected decades of Brotherhood concrete floors marked by oil stains and tire tracks, pool tables occupying one corner, fully stocked bar along the eastern wall, and walls covered with photographs spanning 40 years of history. Tonight, every member who could physically attend was present, and those who couldn't had dialed in through laptops propped on tables, their faces watching from distant cities, as Marcus stood at the front of the room with Emma sleeping in Sarah's arms, in the back office safe and whole because of a kid nobody had known existed until this morning. Marcus's voice when he spoke carried across the crowded space with authority earned through 15 years of leadership, but also with emotion he didn't try to hide because hiding emotion in moments like this suggested weakness rather than strength. A homeless kid 12 years old took a beating meant for my daughter. Two grown men armed professionals who've been kidnapping children across 3 states. And this kid charged them without hesitation, without weapons, without backup, threw himself between my daughter and whatever fate those men had planned for her. The room had gone completely silent. 300 battle-hardened individuals who'd seen violence and hardship and the worst humanity offered, listening to the story of a child who demonstrated courage most adults would never possess. Marcus continued, his jaw tight with emotion that threatened to overwhelm professional demeanor. Doctors say he'll survive, but recovery is going to be long and complicated. I've covered his medical costs, but that's the bare minimum. This kid has no family. Mother died of overdose 8 months ago. No father listed anywhere, ran from foster care after 3 weeks. He's been surviving alone with just a dog sleeping under Henderson Bridge, eating from dumpsters. And yesterday he saved my daughter's life. Sarah stood from where she'd been sitting near the back, Emma still asleep in her arms, and her voice carried the strength that had made her founding member of the Women's Auxiliary. Kid's got no family. Nobody came forward when his mother died. No relatives, no support system, nothing. He's been invisible for 8 months, and he used that invisibility to document threats at Memorial Park, tracking kidnappers nobody else noticed. This isn't about throwing money at a problem and walking away. This child has nothing, and he gave everything to protect our daughter. Tank rose next, his massive frame commanding attention through presence, rather than volume. We owe him life debt. Code is code. If someone bled for any of our families, we'd move heaven and earth to honor that debt. Doesn't matter that he's a stranger. He stopped being a stranger the moment he threw himself between Emma and those kidnappers. He saved one of ours, which makes him ours if he'll have us. But the response wasn't uniformly supportive, and the debate that followed demonstrated the complexity beneath the Brotherhood's unified exterior. Ash, a younger member, barely into his 20s, raised concerns that others felt, but hesitated to voice. We're a motorcycle club, not a foster agency. Kid needs professionals, therapists, social services. We're not equipped to handle a traumatized 12-year-old. What happens when CPS starts asking questions about bikers taking custody of homeless minor? What happens when media decides this is exploitation instead of genuine help? His words generated murmurs of agreement from some corners, pragmatic considerations that couldn't be ignored even when urgency demanded action. But Cole Harrison, a veteran in his 50s who'd been homeless himself after returning from deployment 15 years ago, stood with expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this particular challenge. I was where that kid is now, came back from overseas with nothing, no job, no place, just me and nightmares that wouldn't stop. This club found me sleeping behind a grocery store and decided I mattered when the system had already written me off. They gave me work, gave me purpose, gave me family when I thought I'd lost the ability to connect with anyone. Cole's voice grew stronger, carrying conviction earned through lived experience. This is what we do. We protect our own. And anyone who bleeds for our family becomes family. That's not sentiment, that's code. The system failed this kid the same way it failed me. We don't get to walk away just because helping him is complicated. We show up when it matters, or nothing we claim to stand for means anything. The vote, when it came, reflected both the unity and the fractures within the Brotherhood. Marcus laid out the proposal clearly. The club would ride to the hospital when Liam was stable enough for visitors to demonstrate solidarity that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. They would provide protection, resources, support, whatever was needed to give a 12-year-old boy the childhood he'd been denied through circumstances beyond his control. The commitment would be comprehensive and long-term, not temporary charity that evaporated when inconvenience exceeded good intentions. 287 hands rose in favor, 13 opposed. The majority was overwhelming, but the dissent was visible, a reminder that even bonds forged through shared purpose could strain under pressure of decisions that demanded sacrifice without guarantee of positive outcome. Tank addressed those who'd voted against the motion with respect, that acknowledged their concerns while making club's position clear. You voted your conscience and that's respected. But once the vote passes, we stand united. This kid gets our full support, all of us. Anyone who can't commit to that needs to step aside now. Nods came from the dissenters, acknowledgement that disagreement about approach didn't negate loyalty to the club's collective decision. They would support Liam because the Brotherhood had voted to support him, because unity mattered more than individual reservations, because sometimes you trusted your brother's judgment even when your own doubts persisted. After the meeting dispersed into smaller conversations and planning sessions, Tank pulled Marcus aside with expression that suggested news requiring privacy. Detective Morrison called while you were speaking. They found Walsh's license plate on traffic cameras heading south toward California border. FBI's involved now because kidnapping across state lines triggers federal jurisdiction. But Morrison says Walsh's old captain, this Richard Webb, is actively blocking investigation, claiming insufficient evidence suggesting the abduction attempt was misidentified, basically running interference that suggests he's getting paid to protect Walsh. This goes higher than we thought. Marcus processed implications that kept expanding like ripples from stone thrown into still water. Imama had been targeted by professional kidnappers, protected by corrupt police captain, saved by homeless boy, who was now himself a witness capable of identifying Walsh, which meant threats extended beyond the immediate crisis into complications that would require sustained vigilance to address safely. Helping Liam meant inheriting enemies, accepting risks, committing resources to protection that extended indefinitely because threats like Walsh didn't simply vanish when initial attempts failed. But the alternative, walking away and leaving a 12-year-old to face those threats alone, wasn't acceptable to Marcus or to the club that had just voted overwhelmingly to honor the debt owed to a child who demonstrated courage none of them could dismiss as anything less than heroic. The commitment was made, the die cast, and whatever came next would be faced collectively rather than individually. Marcus made one more phone call that night, scrolling through contacts to find Angela Torres, an attorney who'd worked with the club on various community initiatives and whose expertise in family law made her the logical choice for navigating the bureaucratic complexities ahead. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the efficient professionalism of someone accustomed to late-night calls from clients who needed immediate guidance. Marcus, what's wrong? He explained the situation, concisely hitting key points without unnecessary detail. 12-year-old homeless kid saved Emma Club, voted to provide custody and support, needed legal counsel for navigating CPS and establishing guardianship. Angela listened without interrupting her silence, conveying attention rather than judgment. And when Marcus finished, her response came after pause that suggested she was already calculating obstacles they'd face. That's going to be complicated, very complicated. Social services doesn't typically approve motorcycle clubs taking custody of vulnerable minors, even when intentions are pure. You're looking at home studies, background checks, psychological evaluations, ongoing oversight. They'll fight you on this. Marcus's voice carried determination that Angela knew well enough not to challenge. Then we fight back. Kid deserves family that shows up. We showed up. If the system wants to argue that's not good enough, we'll demonstrate why they're wrong. Angela's response was pragmatic but not discouraging. I'm in. We'll need to move carefully, document everything, prove you can provide stable environment. But if you're committed, we can make this work. I'll start filing paperwork tomorrow. First step is getting you cleared as emergency foster placement while Liam recovers. That buys us time to build a permanent case. At Oregon Medical Center, surgery was concluding after 6 hours of meticulous work repairing internal damage that would leave scars but shouldn't prove fatal if infection didn't complicate recovery. Liam remained unconscious, body preserved in medical coma, while swelling stabilized and systems recovered from trauma. Machines monitored vitals that remained concerning but showed improvement, gradual progress towards stability that doctors had doubted was achievable when he'd first arrived. In the waiting room outside ICU, Marcus sat alone with notebook he'd retrieved from police after they'd photographed every page as evidence. He turned pages slowly, studying sketches and observations that revealed a mind trained to notice details others missed, patterns documented with precision that spoke of intelligence undiminished by circumstances. Liam Bennett had spent 8 months invisible, using that invisibility to protect people who didn't know he existed, who wouldn't have noticed him even if they'd passed within arm's reach. He'd cared about strangers' safety more than his own survival, had maintained moral compass, that homelessness hadn't corrupted, had chosen courage when every lesson life taught suggested self-preservation was only rational response to a world that didn't care whether you lived or died. That level of character deserved better than the streets had given him. Deserved family stability, opportunity to become whoever he was capable of becoming when basic needs weren't consuming all available energy and attention. The debt Marcus felt wasn't obligation imposed by external code, but recognition that some actions demanded response transcending calculation of personal cost. Liam had given everything for Emma. The least Marcus could do was give Liam chance at life worth living. As dawn broke over Portland 48 hours after the incident, painting hospital corridors with pale light that suggested new beginnings, Liam's eyes fluttered open briefly for first time since surgery. Consciousness lasted only seconds, barely long enough for Nurse Patricia to register that he was waking, but his first words were clear enough to note in medical chart, despite slurred speech that came with skull fracture and medications. "Scout? Where's Scout?" Then awareness faded again, pulling him back under before Patricia could respond. But she made note patient's first concern upon regaining consciousness was his dog. Not his injuries, not his pain, just his dog. She didn't know that Marcus was already handling Scout's situation, had retrieved the dog from animal control yesterday, had him vet checked and groomed, and was keeping him at the Kane property until Liam was stable enough to be reunited. Didn't know that 300 motorcycles would roll into hospital parking lot tomorrow, that cavalry was coming, that invisible boy's life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Pain arrived before consciousness, deep and throbbing in Liam's ribs with every shallow breath he managed. His skull pulsed in rhythm with heartbeat that felt too loud, too present, announcing damage that would require months to heal properly. When he finally forced his eyes open, fluorescent lights stabbed through pupils that hadn't adjusted yet, an antiseptic smell filled nostrils, accustomed to bridge dampness and river mud. The hospital room materialized slowly, white walls and beeping machines, and the face of Nurse Patricia hovering with practiced efficiency that suggested she'd been monitoring his return to awareness. Her voice carried gentle warmth meant to comfort patients emerging from trauma. "Welcome back, sweetheart. You've been out about 14 hours. Try not to move too much. You've got 3 fractured ribs, skull fracture, and we had to stop some internal bleeding. You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. The word felt foreign, applied to someone who'd been beaten unconscious on park pavement, but Liam supposed she was correct in the most technical sense. His heart continued beating. His lungs continued drawing air, despite ribs that protested each expansion. That counted for something. Jenkins arrived within minutes, middle-aged physician with kind eyes that had delivered bad news, frequently enough to have perfected the balance between honesty and hope. He explained injuries using medical terminology. Liam only partially understood words like contusion and hematoma that sounded serious without conveying the full reality of recovery, timelines stretching months into uncertain future. Then came the part that made no sense whatsoever, the information that couldn't possibly be accurate. Jenkins's voice remained steady as he delivered news that should have felt like relief. "Your medical bills have been paid in full. Cash. Someone walked in yesterday and settled everything. Surgery, recovery, projected costs for physical therapy, medications, follow-up appointments. You don't owe this hospital a single cent." Liam's confusion must have shown on his swollen face because Jenkins continued with explanation that raised more questions than it answered. The man didn't leave a name, but he was very clear. "You're to receive the best care we can provide, and money isn't a concern. He'll cover whatever treatment you need." Liam's voice emerged rough, damaged by intubation during surgery. I don't have money, I don't have anyone." Jenkins offered smile that suggested he wished he had better answers. "I can't tell you more than what I know, but someone out there believes you're worth investing in. Focus on healing. Let us worry about the rest." Before Liam could process this information, before he could formulate the dozens of questions forming in his battered mind, another visitor appeared at his door. Detective Ray Morrison wore plain clothes with badge clipped to belt his weathered face, carrying an expression that mixed professional detachment with genuine concern. He pulled a chair beside Liam's bed and spoke with careful gentleness of someone interviewing traumatized child who'd already been failed by too many adults. The questions were straightforward enough. What had Liam seen? Why had he intervened? Did he know the men who attacked him? Liam answered as best he could, though memories of the actual beating had already started to blur at edges, his brain mercifully protecting him from full horror of it. What he remembered clearly was Emma's scream, the decision to run toward danger instead of away from it, the certainty that doing nothing would haunt him more than whatever injuries resulted from action. Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Liam with expression that mixed admiration with something close to concern. "You saved Marcus Kane's daughter. Do you know who Marcus Kane is?" Liam shook his head slightly and immediately regretted the movement as pain spiked through his skull. Morrison chose his words carefully, delivering information that explained context without editorializing. Marcus Kane is the president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club. They've got over 300 members across Oregon. They're not a gang, not in the criminal sense, but they're not your average community organization either. Controversial reputation. Some people see them as protectors of their neighborhoods. Others see them as intimidating. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Morrison paused, ensuring Liam was following, despite exhaustion, pulling at consciousness. "Here's what you need to understand, kid. These aren't bad guys. I've worked with Marcus on community initiatives. He's helped us with neighborhood watch programs, youth mentorship, things like that. But they're not simple either. They live by their own code, loyalty, brotherhood, protection of their own. And right now they feel they owe you. That's complicated. It means they're going to want to help you, probably in ways that are overwhelming. Just know you don't have to accept anything you're not comfortable with. You're in control here." Liam wanted to ask more, wanted to understand what any of this meant for his future, but exhaustion was pulling at him again. Morrison seemed to sense this and stood to leave. Just before reaching the door, he turned back with expression that conveyed respect earned rather than given. "For what it's worth, what you did was incredibly brave. Incredibly stupid, but incredibly brave. That little girl is alive because of you." After Morrison left, Patricia returned to check vitals. As she adjusted his pillow, she spoke quietly, almost conspiratorially. "There's been someone outside your room every single hour since you arrived, taking shifts. They won't leave. Security tried to make them go, but they're not causing trouble. Just sitting in the hallway waiting." She glanced towards the door, her voice dropping even lower. "I've never seen anything like it. Bikers rotating guard duty for a kid they don't know. Whatever you did, it mattered to them." Liam's eyes followed her gaze to the small window in his hospital room door. He couldn't see anyone from his angle, but he could sense presence beyond it, someone watching, someone waiting. Someone who felt they owed debt to a 12-year-old homeless kid who'd been invisible his entire life until one impossible moment changed everything. 24 hours after the incident, Liam lay in his hospital bed in that strange state between sleep and waking, his body finally beginning to heal enough that pain had dulled to constant ache rather than sharp agony. Morning light filtered through blinds, casting stripes across white sheets that smelled like industrial laundry detergent. The room was quiet except for rhythmic beeping of monitors and distant sounds of hospital coming to life with day shift. Then he heard it, distant at first, so faint he thought he might be imagining it. The low rumble of an engine, then another, then another. The sound grew, building like approaching thunder, deep mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through the hospital's foundation. Liam's eyes opened fully, brow furrowing in confusion as the sound kept growing, multiplying until it wasn't just loud but overwhelming, a wall of noise that had nurses abandoning their stations and rushing to windows. From his bed, Liam couldn't see the parking lot, but he could hear commotion in the hallway, excited voices, nervous voices, someone saying, "Oh my wait, over in Eastvarno." The sound of running footsies as security personnel mobilized. And beneath it all, that incredible rolling thunder of what had to be dozens, no hundreds of motorcycle engines, all arriving at once in perfectly orchestrated formation. 300 motorcycles pulled into Oregon Medical Center's parking lot in display, that would be talked about for years to come. They arrived in organized waves, chapter by chapter, the Iron Wolves MC leading the procession with Marcus Kane at the front. But they weren't alone. Allied clubs from across Oregon had shown up in solidarity. Devil's Advocates Road, Saints Thunder Ridge, their own colors and patches representing network of Brotherhood that spanned hundreds of miles. The bikes gleamed in morning sun chrome and paint and leather, ridden by men and women who'd taken time off work, driven hours united for single purpose, to honor debt owed to a 12-year-old kid who'd saved one of their own. Hospital security didn't know what to do with 300 bikers assembling peacefully in their parking lot. They called police immediately, voices tight with anxiety, expecting trouble, expecting violence, expecting something to go terribly wrong. But when police arrived with sirens silent out of respect for hospital environment, they found something entirely different. The bikers had organized themselves in neat rows, military precision that suggested discipline rather than chaos. They weren't revving engines or causing disturbances. They were just there, standing beside their motorcycles, waiting with patient determination that comes from people who understand power of solidarity. Marcus Kane approached the hospital's administrative entrance, flanked by Tank and two other senior members. He found Dr. Reyes, hospital administrator, who'd been called down from her office to deal with what security had described as potential crisis. Marcus's voice was calm, respectful, absolutely unwavering. "We're here to see Liam Bennett. All of us. We'll wait however long it takes. We don't cause trouble. We just honor debts. That boy saved my daughter's life. These people have come to pay their respects, to let him know he's not alone anymore. We understand if you can't accommodate everyone at once. We're willing to work within your rules." Dr. Reyes looked out at 300 people who'd shown up for a homeless child nobody had cared about 48 hours ago, and something in her expression softened. She made decisions that would either be brilliant or get her reprimanded by the board. Small groups, supervised visits throughout the day. No more than 5 people in his room at a time, and only if he consents to visitors. He's been through trauma, and I won't have him overwhelmed. Marcus nodded immediately, extended his hand, shook hers with genuine gratitude. "You have my word. We'll follow every rule you set." The compromise spread through the assembled crowd quickly. Members settled in for what would clearly be all-day vigil, some sitting on their bikes, others standing in clusters talking quietly. A few went to get coffee from the hospital cafeteria, leaving cash tips that were triple the bill. They were prepared to wait as long as necessary to show this kid that 300 people had driven across state lines because his life mattered, because his courage deserved recognition, because the code demanded they demonstrate that nobody who bled for their family would ever face the world alone again. On the 3rd floor, Patricia knocked gently on Liam's door before entering. Her name tag caught light as she moved to his bedside, eyes bright with something Liam couldn't quite identify. "Liam, sweetheart, you have visitors. They've asked permission to come see you. You can say no if you want, but I think you should say yes." Liam's voice came out confused, weak from injuries and medications. "Who would want to visit me?" Patricia smiled with expression that suggested she understood something he didn't yet. "Everyone, apparently." The door opened wider and Marcus Kane walked in his presence, filling the small hospital room. He was followed by a Tank whose road name suddenly made perfect sense given his size. Sarah Kane entered next, her face showing traces of tears recently shed. A senior member named Wrench completed the group. But it was the 5th person who made Liam's heart stop completely, who made everything else fade into background noise that didn't matter. A younger club member, probably early 20s, carried a wiggling bundle of rust-colored fur wrapped in clean blanket. Scout. They'd found Scout. The dog's tail was wagging so hard his whole body shook, and the moment he saw Liam, he started whining and squirming, desperate to reach his boy to confirm that Liam was alive, despite the blood and violence and terror of their last moments together. The young member approached the bed, carefully mindful of medical equipment, and set Scout on the mattress with movements that suggested he understood how much this reunion meant. Scout immediately crawled up to Liam's chest, licking his face, whimpering with joy and relief, pressing close, like he was trying to merge with Liam's body and never be separated again. Liam broke, completely and utterly broke. His arms wrapped around Scout and he sobbed into the dog's fur, 8 months of loneliness and fear and isolation pouring out in great shaking gasps that hurt his fractured ribs but couldn't be contained. He cried for his mother, for the life he'd lost, for the beating and the pain and the terror. But mostly he cried because someone had cared enough to save the one thing that mattered most to him, because someone had seen him, had understood what Scout meant, had taken action to reunite them, when Liam had been utterly powerless to protect the only family he had left. Marcus spoke quietly, giving Liam time to process emotions that needed release. We pulled him from animal control yesterday, paid the fees, got him vet checked, made sure he had all his shots, got him cleaned up. He's yours, kid. He's always been yours. Once Liam's tears had subsided to quiet hiccups and Scout had settled against his side, warm presence that anchored him to reality, the others in the room quietly stepped back toward the door, giving Marcus space to pull chair close to hospital bed. He sat slowly, his large frame somehow gentle in the way he positioned himself at Liam's eye level, not looming, not intimidating, just present. Marcus's voice when he spoke was rough with emotion. He wasn't trying to hide. You gave my daughter her life. You didn't hesitate. You didn't stop to think about what it would cost you. You just acted. That kind of courage is rare, especially in someone who has every reason to look out for only themselves, who's learned the hard way that the world doesn't give much back. He paused, his eyes holding Liam's with intensity that made the boy feel seen in ways he'd never experienced. I need you to understand what that means to me, to my family, to everyone standing in that parking lot right now. You saved Emma when you had no obligation, no expectation of reward, nothing except the knowledge that a child needed help and you were the only one willing to give it. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are, Liam Bennett. What came next was delivered not as sales pitch, but as simple statement of fact, an offer laid out with complete transparency. Marcus explained that Liam's medical care was fully covered, not just for current injuries, but ongoing for as long as he needed it. Physical therapy, counseling, if he wanted it, checkups, everything. The club had already handled it. Then came education. Marcus had enrolled Liam in Riverside Academy, private school with small classes and teachers who actually cared. Enrollment was complete, supplies purchased. He could start whenever he was ready. No pressure, no timeline, just opportunity, waiting when he was prepared to take it. Housing was next. Marcus and Sarah had guest house on their property, small but complete with own bedroom, bathroom, living space. Liam and Scout were welcome there for as long as they needed, not as guests, but as family. When Liam got older, if he was interested, there were apprenticeships available through legitimate club businesses, motorcycle repair, community outreach programs, youth mentorship. Skills he could build life on, honest work that paid well and meant something. But the last part, the most important part, Marcus delivered with careful weight. Family, the Iron Wolves, protection, mentorship, belonging. 300 people who will show up when you need them, who will teach you, support you, and expect nothing but that you be yourself and try your best. That's what we're offering. Liam's face had gone carefully, blank walls he'd built on streets, slamming back into place. His voice turned hard, defensive, carrying edge of someone who'd learned that offers sounding too good to be true inevitably came with hidden prices. I don't take charity. I've been offered help before. Foster families who said they cared. Social workers who promised things would get better. Systems that were supposed to protect me. It always comes with strings. Always. People want something even if they don't say it up front. I'd rather be on my own than owe someone something I can't pay back. Marcus didn't flinch at the resistance. If anything, seemed to have expected it, maybe even respected it. This isn't charity, Liam. It's a debt. You bled for my family. In our world, in the code we live by, that means something permanent. It creates bond that doesn't break. He gestured toward the door, toward hundreds of people waiting outside. Every person out there understands what you did. They know what it cost you, and they're here because honoring that debt is who we are. This isn't transaction. This isn't temporary. You saved my daughter, and that makes you ours now, if you'll have us. Marcus's voice dropped lower, more personal. You don't have to join the club. You don't have to do anything except be a kid. Go to school, play with your dog, figure out who you want to be without worrying where your next meal comes from or where you'll sleep at night. Let people care about you. Learn what it feels like to be part of something. And if you want to walk away when you're 18, you can. No strings, no guilt, no debt collected. Just let us help until then. Let us give you the childhood you should have had all along. Liam wanted to argue, wanted to find the catch, the hidden price tag that always came with adults offering things that sounded too good to be true. But as he looked at Marcus's face at Sarah standing quietly by the door with tears in her eyes at Tank's solid presence and Wrench's gentle nod of agreement, he couldn't find the lie. These people had shown up. They'd found Scout. They'd paid his hospital bills without being asked, without knowing if he'd accept anything else they offered. They'd done all of it before ever having this conversation, before knowing if their investment would be acknowledged or reciprocated. Before Liam could formulate response, there was knock at door. Detective Morrison stepped in, nodding respectfully to Marcus before addressing Liam directly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but I thought you'd want to know this immediately. Your notebook, the one with all those license plate observations, it became critical evidence. We used it to track the pattern of that white sedan and connected it to 6 other attempted abductions over the past month. This morning, we executed warrants that led to 7 arrests and the recovery of 4 children who had been taken. Full kidnapping ring, Liam. We brought it down because you were paying attention when nobody else was. The room went absolutely silent. Liam stared at the detective, unable to process what he was hearing. 4 children, 4 kids who were alive, who were going home to their families because he'd sketched license plates in notebook while sitting alone in park, trying to stay ahead of threats nobody else noticed or cared about. Morrison continued, his voice filled with genuine respect. You've been protecting people without even knowing it, kid. Maybe it's time someone protected you. After Morrison left, Marcus spoke again, his words landing with weight of absolute truth. You're not invisible anymore, Liam. You never should have been. And if you let us, we'll make sure you never have to be again. Liam looked down at Scout, felt warm weight of dog pressed against ribs that would heal but would always carry a reminder of this moment. He thought about 4 children going home, about 300 people waiting in parking lot because they believed his life had value, about 8 months of being cold and hungry and alone, of survival strategies and invisible routines and constant fear that came with having nothing and no one with him. And then he thought about what Marcus was offering. Not charity, family. His voice came out as barely whisper, but it was most important word he'd ever spoken, okay. 24 hours later, complications that Marcus had warned about began materializing with speed that suggested they'd been inevitable from the moment he'd made commitment to help Liam. Elena Martinez arrived at hospital with expression that blended professional concern with skepticism earned through 16 years of child protective services work. She reviewed Liam's file methodically: homeless minor, no guardians, no family, and now motorcycle clubs seeking involvement in his care. Every instinct developed through years of protecting vulnerable children was firing warnings she couldn't ignore. Her conversation with Marcus in hospital corridor was cordial, but firm. I understand your intentions are good, Mr. Kane, but motorcycle clubs seeking custody of traumatized minor, the system doesn't typically approve these arrangements. There are protocols, background checks, home studies, psychological evaluations. This will require significant oversight, and there's no guarantee approval will be granted. My job is protecting Liam's interests, not accommodating your club's desire to help. If I determine this placement isn't appropriate, he goes into the system. That's not negotiable. Marcus kept his voice controlled but equally firm. We're prepared for oversight. We want to do this right. Kid needs stability, not another foster placement that fails him. We can provide what he needs: safe home education, medical care, family that actually shows up. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for a chance to prove Liam's better off with us than anywhere else the system might place him. Martinez's response carried weight of authority she'd earned through protecting children when others had failed. I need to interview Liam privately. No club members present. My assessment will determine next steps, and that assessment will be based solely on what serves his best interests, regardless of your club's involvement or how many motorcycles showed up at this hospital. The private interview happened that afternoon, just Martinez and Liam in hospital room, configured to feel less clinical, more conversational. Her questions were direct, probing, designed to identify coercion or pressure that vulnerable children might not recognize as manipulation. Do you feel safe with Marcus Kane? Are you being pressured to accept his offer? Do you understand you have other options? Foster families who are already approved, group homes with professional staff placements, the system has vetted thoroughly. Liam's response was honest in a way only someone who'd survived on streets could be honest, stripping away politeness to deliver truth that mattered more than social niceties. They gave me home, my dog, food, school. They care what happens to me. I'm safe, have meals. Scout's healthy for first time in months. Isn't that what matters? What the system's supposed to provide? He paused, meeting her eyes directly with gaze that suggested he understood exactly what she was evaluating. I've been in the system before. It failed me. Put me with family that treated me like paycheck, not person. I ran because staying was worse than streets. These people haven't failed me. Not yet. Maybe they will. Maybe this falls apart. But right now they're here, they showed up. That's more than anyone else has done since my mom died. Martinez processed his words carefully, seeing transformation in Liam that couldn't be dismissed clean, fed healing engaged rather than shut down. But protocols existed for reasons, safeguards against well-meaning adults whose good intentions evaporated when reality proved more complicated than initial commitment suggested. Her voice remained professional, but not unkind. I need to conduct full investigation, home study, background checks, interviews with club members. This decision will take time, and during that time, you'll remain under hospital care or temporary foster placement. I can't approve permanent custody based on 2 days of good behavior, regardless of how compelling the circumstances. Meanwhile, media discovered the story with speed that suggested someone had deliberately leaked information to maximize attention. Local news picked it up first. Homeless boy saves biker's daughter, MC, offers home. The story spread rapidly across regional outlets, then social media, and by evening it was trending nationally. Liam's face, his name, his entire life, suddenly became public property, dissected and discussed by strangers who had no connection to what had actually happened, but felt entitled to opinions about how situations should be handled. Reactions came in waves, contradictory and overwhelming. Positive comments flooded in, celebrating Liam's heroism and the club's compassion, calling it a beautiful example of community and chosen family, proof that good people existed in unexpected places. But negative responses were just as loud, maybe louder, fueled by suspicion and prejudice that motorcycle clubs couldn't be trusted with vulnerable children regardless of circumstances. Internet commenters questioned the club's motives, suggesting exploitation for public relations, calling it indoctrination of vulnerable child who couldn't possibly consent to arrangement when power dynamics were so skewed. Conspiracy theories emerged about gang recruitment tactics, about trafficking, concerns about dangers that armchair experts claimed to identify, despite having zero firsthand knowledge of situation. Within 48 hours, reporters showed up at Riverside Academy, attempting to interview students about Liam, trying to get photos, seeking comments from teachers who'd never met him. They camped outside Kane property with telephoto lenses pointed at guest house, attempting to capture footage of boy who'd become unwitting media sensation. Owen, who'd spent 8 months perfecting invisibility to survive, suddenly couldn't escape visibility, no matter how desperately he wanted to retreat into anonymity that had once felt like prison, but now seemed like sanctuary compared to exposure that made every moment feel invaded. The breaking point came when social services received anonymous complaint about gang involvement with minor potential danger to child's well-being. Formal investigation was opened. Elena Martinez was assigned not just to conduct home study, but to determine whether placement with Kane family constituted appropriate environment or represented risk requiring immediate intervention. Same system that had failed to protect Liam when he was homeless, that had placed him with foster family, that treated him like burden, was now threatening first stable home he'd had in almost a year. The club's response was immediate and coordinated, demonstrating organizational capacity that skeptics claimed didn't exist within motorcycle culture. Marcus hired Angela Torres, attorney specializing in family law, who'd worked with Iron Wolves on legitimate community initiatives and whose expertise would be essential for navigating bureaucratic complexities ahead. She handled all media inquiries, issued statements, setting firm boundaries, made clear that Liam was minor, whose privacy would be protected by any legal means necessary. Club members, without being asked, created privacy perimeter around Kane property and Riverside Academy, not threatening, not illegal, just present, making sure reporters couldn't get close enough to a harassed child who'd already endured more trauma than most adults faced in lifetime. Marcus sat down with Liam in guest house one evening after a particularly difficult day where three different journalists had tried to approach him despite school security. His voice was steady, serious, carrying protective instinct that had become increasingly paternal. You don't owe anyone your story, not reporters, not the internet, not people who think they know what's best for you without ever having met you. This is your life, not their headline. We'll protect your privacy as much as legally can. And if you want to speak out, that's your choice too. But it has to be your choice, not because you feel pressured or obligated. 1 week after rescue, Liam was discharged from hospital with list of medications, strict instructions about physical therapy, and strange sensation of walking towards something instead of away from it. Sarah drove them in family SUV rather than motorcycle. Marcus in passenger seat, scout alert, in back beside Liam, sensing significance of this journey, even if he couldn't understand destination. The guest house sat behind main residence, small structure with cream-colored siding and red door that looked like it belonged in storybook rather than real life. When Sarah unlocked door and stepped aside to let Liam enter first, he stood frozen in doorway, unable to move forward. Clean. That was first thing hitting him with force that threatened to overwhelm careful control he'd maintained. Clean walls, clean floors, clean windows, letting in actual sunlight. Small living area with couch and television. Bedroom with real bed, not cardboard, with sheets smelling like laundry detergent and comforter thick enough to keep out any cold. Bathroom with hot water and towels stacked on shelf. Tiny kitchen with refrigerator Sarah had already stocked with simple foods she thought 12-year-old might like. It was more than Owen had lived in even before his mother died, more than he'd imagined having access to when survival had been measured in days rather than dreams. The overwhelm made his chest-tight hands shake walls he'd built, threatening to crumble completely. Emma appeared in doorway that afternoon, small frame, hesitant eyes still holding shadows of what had happened in park. She didn't speak initially, just stood there holding something behind her back. Liam, sitting on couch with Scout's head in his lap, gave her what he hoped was encouraging nod. She stepped inside carefully, then thrust forward piece of paper drawing, created with crayons depicting park scene, fountain little girl, and figure that could only be Liam, with cape flowing behind him, standing between her and two dark scribbled shapes. At top, in careful letters, someone had helped her spell, "Thank you for saving me. You are my hero." Liam took drawing with hands that trembled, studying every crayon stroke, every color choice, every detail of how 6-year-old had processed trauma in his sacrifice. He carefully folded it and put it in pocket where he'd keep it until paper wore thin from repeated handling. "You're welcome, Emma. I'm glad you're safe." She smiled small and genuine, then ran back to main house. Her fear of him seemingly dissolved by acknowledgement that he was safe too, that heroes could be human and vulnerable, and worthy of gratitude expressed through crayon and construction paper. 2 weeks post-rescue, Elena Martinez concluded her investigation with thoroughness that suggested she took responsibility seriously. She'd toured guest house, reviewed Kane family dynamics, spoken with club members, consulted with Detective Morrison about kidnapping incident, examined Marcus and Sarah's backgrounds, evaluated club's legitimate businesses and community programs. Her findings painted a picture of unconventional arrangement that nonetheless provided stability Liam desperately needed. But complications persisted. Captain Richard Webb, Derek Walsh's protector within police department, called Martinez directly with anonymous tip about MC's gang activity, suggesting placement with club was dangerous despite lack of evidence supporting claims. Martinez recognized intimidation tactics when she encountered them and reported interference to her superiors, but pressure from law enforcement complicated approval process in ways that required judicial intervention. Public hearing was scheduled to determine permanent custody judge needing to approve arrangement given MC, involvement and media attention surrounding case. Courtroom packed with supporters and skeptics, reporters filling back rows, tension thick enough that bailiff maintained heightened alertness throughout proceedings. Arguments presented followed predictable lines. CPS attorney obligated to question arrangement regardless of personal opinion, raised concerns about motorcycle club, lacking traditional family structure, questioned whether environment was appropriate for traumatized minor, suggested more conventional placements might serve Liam's interest better. Angela Torres defended with evidence of Liam's transformation, medical records showing excellent care, school enrollment, demonstrating proper educational support, psychological evaluation indicating he was thriving in current placement, and most importantly, Liam's own testimony delivered privately to Judge in chambers where crowd couldn't influence his honesty. Judge spoke to Liam alone, no attorneys present, just 12-year-old and judicial authority trying to determine what truly served child's best interests. Do you feel safe with Kane family? Do you want to stay there? Have you been pressured or coerced? Do you understand other options exist? Liam's answers were clear, direct carrying conviction that came from knowing exactly what he was choosing. They gave me family when I had nothing. I'm safe fed going to school, have my dog. For first time in 8 months, I'm not just surviving, I'm living. People think bikers are scary. I thought that too before, but they showed up when nobody else did. System failed me. Foster care failed me. These people haven't, and I trust them. Judge's ruling delivered after reviewing all evidence and testimony acknowledged unconventional nature of arrangement, but couldn't dismiss outcome that was undeniable. Liam was thriving. Formal foster placement was approved with the Marcus and Sarah becoming legal guardians. 6-month review. Required a standard oversight but immediate custody granted based on preponderance of evidence, suggesting this placement served child's best interests above convention or prejudice. Outside courthouse media circus erupted with reporters shouting questions. Angela made brief statement about Liam finding family who loved him, emphasized that privacy should be respected. Moving forward, then ushered everyone to waiting vehicles before additional questions could complicate victory they'd just secured. But victory came with warning. Tank delivered privately after they'd returned to Kane property. Captain Webb left courthouse too fast. This isn't over for him. Derek Walsh is still at large, investigations ongoing, and Webb's blocking it at every turn. They'll come at this differently now that legal approach failed. Detective Morrison confirmed when he called later that evening Walsh had vanished after failed abduction. No leads on location, Webb running interference, claiming insufficient evidence suggesting abduction attempt, was misidentified, basically protecting Walsh through channels Morrison was still trying to map. Emma had been targeted specifically, someone had marked her. And until they understood why and identified who had provided intelligence to kidnappers, threat remained active and evolving. Marcus hadn't told Liam about ongoing threat, wanting him to heal without additional fear, but reality couldn't be avoided indefinitely. That evening in guest house, when Liam confronted him about increased security and private phone calls, and Sarah's worried glances, Marcus made decision that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, mattered more than temporary comfort built on incomplete information. Marcus explained carefully, age-appropriate version that didn't minimize danger but didn't traumatize unnecessarily. Derek Walsh, the man who tried to take Emma, is still out there. He targeted her specifically. We don't know why yet. Until we find him, we're being careful. You're safe, Emma's safe. But we're watchful, and that's why you're seeing club members around more frequently. Liam's fear returned immediately, child's logic suggesting solution that seemed obvious. I brought danger to you by saving her. Maybe I should go keep you safe by leaving. Marcus's response was fierce, protective, leaving no room for misunderstanding. No, you're not going anywhere. You didn't bring danger. You stopped it. We protect our own, and you're ours now. Whatever threat exists, we face it together. That's not negotiable. Sarah joined them, her voice carrying equal conviction. Family means staying when it's hard. You stayed when Emma needed you. We stay now that you need us. That's how this works. Liam's transformation moment came then, realization dawning that family meant standing together rather than isolating to protect others. That strength came from unity rather than solitary burden-bearing. His voice was quiet but certain. Okay, together then. Phone rang moments later, Marcus answering with expression that darkened as Detective Morrison's urgent voice delivered news requiring immediate response. We found Walsh's hideout. You need to see this. It's worse than we thought. Much worse. At Walsh's abandoned warehouse, Morrison showed Marcus photographs and evidence that transformed their understanding of threat they faced. Wall covered with surveillance photos not just of Emma, but dozen other children, all connected to high-value families, all documented with schedules and routines and vulnerabilities. Organized kidnapping ring targeting specific kids based on intelligence that required inside source. Information was coming from someone with access to families, someone feeding Walsh details that enabled precise targeting. Most disturbing discovery was evidence suggesting Trader existed within circle of trust, school staff, club, associate business partner, someone close enough to observe patterns without raising suspicion. Morrison's warning was stark. Walsh didn't work alone. Ring is bigger than we knew. Someone in your circle might be feeding information. Until we identify, source everyone suspect. Trust no one new. Watch everyone carefully. Marcus returned home without telling Liam full scope of threat, but security increased subtly. MC remained on high alert. Investigation continued quietly while Liam settled into new life, unaware how deep danger really went. That night, Liam finally slept peacefully with Scout beside him, guest house dark and quiet, recovery progressing despite complications swirling beyond his awareness. But in shadows outside, Kane property figure stood watching, observing, taking notes and photographs with methodical precision that mirrored Liam's own documentation habits, but served sinister purpose. Threat wasn't over. It was escalating. And the debt Marcus had committed to honoring would demand far more than anyone had anticipated when 300 motorcycles rolled into hospital parking lot to save Invisible Boy, who'd chosen courage over safety. Riverside Academy terrified Liam in ways the beating hadn't fear manifesting not as physical threat, but as exposure to normalcy. He'd lost access 2 years before circumstances had spiraled beyond control. He stood outside the building on his first morning backpack Sarah had purchased filled with supplies he hadn't selected, wearing clothes that fit properly, but felt foreign against skin accustomed to threadbare fabric and grime. Students clustered in groups demonstrating easy familiarity of children who'd known each other for years, their laughter carrying across courtyard where Liam remained frozen, paralyzed by certainty that he didn't belong among people whose lives had remained intact while his had shattered completely. Marcus had driven him that morning truck cab filled with silence that felt supportive rather than oppressive. Before Liam climbed out, Marcus offered words meant to anchor him through panic, threatening to overwhelm careful composure. You don't have to be anyone but yourself in there. Nobody's expecting perfect. Just show up and try. That's all we're asking. The homeroom teacher, Miss Warren, possessed enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than performative. Her smile warm when she noticed Liam taking a seat in back corner, where instinct to remain invisible kicked in automatically. When she asked him to introduce himself to the class, dread flooded through him with intensity that made breathing difficult. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward him with curiosity, ranging from mild interest to complete disinterest, and his mind went blank for several long seconds before finding words simple enough to deliver without voice cracking. I like dogs and fixing things. I'm still figuring out the rest. It wasn't eloquent, wasn't impressive, but it was honest. Miss Warren thanked him, and he sat down feeling both exposed and oddly relieved that he'd survived the moment without collapsing entirely. Morning classes moved faster than Liam could process information, flying past comprehension, shaped by 8 months away from formal education. Math concepts he'd missed entirely during time on streets. History discussions referencing events he had no context for understanding. Science labs with equipment he'd never used and in procedures that seemed designed to highlight how far behind he'd fallen. He took notes frantically, knowing he'd need tutor Sarah had arranged to explain everything he was failing to grasp in real time. Lunch presented new problem requiring navigation of social dynamics he didn't understand. The cafeteria organized itself through invisible but absolute boundaries. Tables claimed by established groups whose membership criteria remained mysterious to outsiders. Liam grabbed tray, got food he barely looked at, scanned for somewhere to sit that wouldn't require inserting himself where he wasn't wanted. Empty table and corner felt safer than attempting integration with classmates whose lives bore no resemblance to his own experience. He'd made it halfway through sandwich when someone approached skinny kid about his age, wearing glasses and shirt featuring equation Liam didn't recognize. The boy gestured to empty seat across from Liam with directness that was oddly refreshing. You're the kid the bikers brought, right? Word travels fast in school this eyes. I'm Danny. Liam tensed, unsure where this was heading, but nodded slowly. Danny continued without apparent judgment. That's pretty cool, honestly. Also, you look like you needed table. My friends and I sit over there if you want to join us. We're mostly science nerds and book people. Not exactly popular crowd, but we don't bite. Something about Danny's matter-of-fact honesty, the lack of pity or excessive curiosity made Liam's decision easy. Yeah, okay, thanks. He followed Danny to nearby table where three other kids sat engaged in animated debate about programming languages. Introductions happened quickly, questions asked were normal things rather than interrogation about trauma. What classes was he taking? Had he seen latest Marvel movie? Did he play video games? Normal conversation treating him like regular kid rather than charity case or spectacle. By lunch's end, Liam had contributed to debate about whether electric or gasoline motorcycles were superior, mentioned Scout, which prompted someone to show pictures of their own dog, and felt something unfamiliar settling in his chest that might eventually become friendship if given time to develop properly. But adjustment wasn't smooth trajectory toward healing. Nightmares intensified during second week. Liam waking gasping with phantom pain in ribs and taste of blood in mouth that wasn't actually there. Derek Walsh's face materialized in dreams with clarity that consciousness couldn't maintain, boots connecting with vulnerable flesh. Emma's screams mixing with sounds Liam's memory had manufactured to fill gaps trauma had created. Marcus heard him through walls separating guest house from main residence, would come sit outside without intruding, presence alone, helping more than words could have accomplished. 3 weeks after moving in, Liam received first real homework assignment requiring essay about personal hero. The irony wasn't lost on him, classmates probably writing about firefighters or athletes, while Liam had become public symbol of heroism he didn't feel qualified to represent. He stared at blank page for 2 hours before Scout's wet nose, nudging his hand, broke paralysis enough to start writing about Mrs. Holloway, elderly woman, who'd fed him sandwiches without making him feel like burden requiring rescue. Miss Warren's comments praised his choice of everyday hero rather than obvious selection noted. His writing showed unusual emotional depth. For 12-year-olds suggested he continue developing observational skills that clearly came naturally. Meanwhile, Detective Morrison's investigation had progressed through painstaking evidence collection that couldn't be rushed despite urgency driving everyone involved. Walsh's warehouse had yielded treasure trove of documentation, surveillance photos, detailed schedules, notes about security vulnerabilities, financial records, showing payments from shell companies that required forensic accounting to trace. But critical breakthrough came from unexpected source when Morrison cross-referenced license plates photographed at Walsh's warehouse with traffic camera footage from various locations where targeted families lived and worked. One plate appeared with frequency that couldn't be coincidence. Silver Honda registered to administrative assistant named Patricia Chen, who worked at Riverside Academy. Further investigation revealed Chen's financial records showed irregular deposits totaling $40,000 over 6-month period payments that coincided exactly with Walsh's kidnapping attempts. Phone records confirmed regular contact between Chen and burner phone traced to Walsh's known locations. The inside source had been identified, but arresting her prematurely would alert Walsh to investigation's progress and potentially cause him to vanish permanently. Morrison coordinated with FBI to set trap, allowing Chen to believe her role remained undiscovered while monitoring all communication for indication of Walsh's current location. The waiting required patience that felt excruciating when threat remained active and children stayed vulnerable, but methodical approach proved necessary when Chen finally received text indicating Walsh planned to make another attempt, this time targeting state senator's daughter attending private school in Eugene. Coordinated raid happened at dawn 2 weeks later. Simultaneous arrests of Walsh in Eugene and Chen at her Portland apartment, 7 additional conspirators identified through financial records and phone data, entire kidnapping ring dismantled an operation that recovered evidence linking them to 14 attempted abductions across Pacific Northwest over 18-month period. Walsh's interrogation revealed network funded by wealthy individuals willing to pay premium for children they believed could be ransomed, or worse, trafficking operation masked as kidnapping ring to obscure true scope of criminality involved. Captain Webb's involvement emerged during interrogation when Walsh, facing federal charges carrying life sentences, offered cooperation in exchange for reduced sentence. Webb had been receiving payments to block investigations, redirect resources, destroy evidence that would have stopped Walsh months earlier if corruption hadn't protected operation at institutional level. Internal Affairs opened investigation that would eventually result in Webb's termination and federal prosecution, but vindication came too late for families whose children had been taken while police captain prioritized personal profit over public safety. Marcus learned details through Morrison's carefully worded briefing that acknowledged how close Emma had come to being Walsh's next successful abduction. If Liam hadn't intervened, if that notebook hadn't documented the pattern, if anything had gone differently that morning, we might never have stopped them. Kids saved more than just your daughter. He saved every child Walsh would have taken afterward. The statement should have brought closure, but Marcus found himself processing guilt that Emma had been targeted at all, that his role as MC president had made her valuable commodity in eyes of criminals who viewed children as assets rather than human beings deserving protection. Sarah found him in garage late that night, working on motorcycle with intensity that suggested he was trying to outrun thoughts he couldn't escape. You can't blame yourself for what almost happened. You can only be grateful for what Liam prevented. He's part of our family now. That's what matters. 6-month review with Dr. Martinez, approached with less anxiety than initial custody hearing, had generated transformation in Liam being undeniable to anyone observing objectively. She conducted interview at Kane property rather than sterile office, noting immediately how Liam had gained weight that suggested regular meals, how his posture had shifted from defensive crouch to something approaching normal adolescent confidence, how Scout followed him with trust that traumatized dog wouldn't show if environment contained ongoing threats. Her questions focused on practical matters rather than theoretical concerns. Was Liam attending school consistently? Yes. Perfect attendance since enrollment. Were grades improving? Yes, tutoring had brought him from remedial level to grade-appropriate performance in most subjects. Was he participating in therapy? Yes, weekly sessions with Dr. Chen, who specialized in childhood trauma and reported significant progress processing both mother's death and recent violence. Did he feel safe? The question hung in air for a moment before Liam answered with certainty that surprised even himself. Safer than I've ever felt. Even before everything fell apart with my mom. This is what family's supposed to feel like. Martinez closed her file with expression, suggesting she'd reached conclusion before arriving, but protocol required thorough documentation. Custody remains appropriate. Review in 12 months will determine long-term status, but nothing I've observed suggests this placement should be disrupted. You're doing well, Liam? Keep doing what you're doing. After she left, Marcus found Liam sitting on guest house porch with Scout at his feet, late afternoon sun painting everything gold in way that made ordinary moment feel significant. You know what this means? You're stuck with us now. No getting rid of you, even if you wanted to leave. Liam's smile came easier these days, less guarded, more genuine. Good, because I'm not going anywhere. But healing wasn't linear progression toward wholeness. And 3 months into placement, Liam experienced setback that demonstrated how trauma's effects persisted beneath surface improvements. School field trip to Science Museum should have been an unremarkable event, but crowded spaces triggered panic attack. Liam didn't recognize until he was hyperventilating in bathroom with Danny trying to talk him through breathing exercises he'd learned when his own anxiety had spiraled during middle school transition. Miss Warren called Sarah, who arrived within 15 minutes, to find Liam recovered but shaken, embarrassed by public display of vulnerability he couldn't control despite wanting desperately to appear normal. Dr. Chen explained during next therapy session that triggers were normal part of trauma recovery, that brain needed time to recalibrate threat assessment when it had spent months in survival mode where danger was constant rather than exceptional. She taught Liam grounding techniques, helped him identify early warning signs that panic was building before it overwhelmed his capacity to respond effectively. The work was slow, frustrating, marked by progress that felt inadequate compared to where Liam wanted to be, but incremental improvements accumulated into genuine transformation that became visible to everyone except Liam himself. 8 months after rescue, Iron Wolves held their annual fundraiser for youth programs community event that brought together club members and local families for barbecue and motorcycle show and auctions supporting after-school programs serving at-risk children. Marcus had been helping organize the event for weeks, but when he asked Liam if he wanted to speak briefly about his experience, the boy's immediate refusal was absolute. I'm not inspiration. I'm just kid who got lucky. Don't make me into symbol I can't live up to. Sarah overheard exchange and intervened with perspective Marcus hadn't considered. You don't have to speak if you don't want to. But other kids who've been through trauma, who feel invisible and worthless and alone, they need to hear that recovery is possible. That found family is real. That courage doesn't mean not being afraid, it means acting anyway when someone needs help. You don't have to be perfect to matter. You just have to be honest. Liam thought about her words for 3 days before approaching Marcus with compromise. I'll speak, but not about being hero, about being homeless, about being scared, about finding family when I thought I'd be alone forever, about how it's okay to need help. That's what matters. The fundraiser drew 500 attendees, families and club members and community leaders who'd supported Iron Wolf's legitimate outreach efforts for years. Liam stood on small stage with microphone that felt too heavy in hands, that trembled despite determination to push through anxiety. And when he spoke, his voice carried across crowd with clarity that came from speaking truth rather than performance. 8 months ago, I was sleeping under bridge with my dog, believing I'd be invisible forever, because that's what kept me safe. Then I saw someone who needed help, and I made choice that changed everything. I'm not telling you this because I'm special. I'm telling you because I was lucky. Lucky that Marcus Kane values honor over convenience. Lucky that 300 bikers decided debt to homeless kid mattered more than complications helping me would create. Lucky that found family is real, not just something people talk about, but don't actually do. He paused, fighting emotion threatening to crack voice he was working to keep steady. If you're alone right now, if you feel invisible, if you think nobody cares whether you exist or disappear, I need you to know something: you matter. Your life has value even when world treats you like burden. And somewhere there are people who will show up when you need them, if you're brave enough to let yourself be seen. Being brave doesn't mean not being afraid. Simon. It means acting anyway, because staying invisible hurts more than risking connection. The silence following his speech lasted perhaps 3 seconds before applause erupted, genuine rather than polite recognition of courage required to stand on stage and admit vulnerability when society taught boys that emotional honesty constituted weakness rather than strength. Tank approached afterward with expression that suggested he'd been moved in ways his weathered exterior typically concealed. That took guts, kid. More than charging kidnappers took. This was different kind of brave. 1 year anniversary of rescue arrived with mixture of celebration and reflection. Kane family marking date privately before attending memorial service at Memorial Park, honoring victims of Walsh's kidnapping ring, and celebrating those who'd survived or been rescued before permanent harm occurred. Liam stood with Emma at Fountain, where everything had changed, both of them older now in ways that transcended simple passage of time, and Emma's hand found his with trust that spoke of bond forged through shared trauma, processed differently, but carrying equal weight. Emma had been attending therapy too, working through fear that public spaces had become dangerous, that strangers might grab her when parents weren't watching closely enough, that safety was illusion rather than reasonable expectation. Her nightmares had persisted longer than Marcus had anticipated, but gradually she'd returned to feeding ducks on Wednesdays with increased awareness of surroundings that would probably never fully fade. When reporters approached for anniversary interviews, Emma surprised everyone by speaking with clarity that belied her 7 years. Liam saved me, not just that day, every day after when I was scared. Because he showed me that brave people exist, that getting help isn't weakness, that family means showing up even when it's hard. He's my brother now. That's what matters most. Media coverage of anniversary was extensive but respectful stories, focusing less on sensational details of kidnapping attempt and more on transformation that had occurred in years since Invisible Boy had chosen visibility at moment when it mattered most. Jessica Wright, journalist who'd initially pursued expose, instead wrote thoughtful piece about chosen family and complexity of judging people by appearance rather than action. Her perspective shifted by year of watching Liam thrive in environment conventional wisdom suggested was inappropriate for traumatized minor. But perhaps most significant development came not from external validation, but from internal shift in how Liam perceived himself. Art class assignment to create self-portrait resulted in piece that demonstrated growth. Mr. Patterson immediately recognized as breakthrough moment. Liam had painted himself not as invisible boy, surviving on streets, not as victim of violence, not as rescued charity case, but as young person standing at intersection between past that had shaped him and future he was actively constructing. Background showed bridge and park and hospital, but foreground depicted Liam with scouts surrounded by family, both biological and chosen: Marcus and Sarah and Emma, and club members who'd become constants rather than temporary supports. Mr. Patterson's assessment carried weight of someone who'd taught long enough to recognize when art transcended technique to communicate truth. You're not invisible anymore, but more than that, you don't want to be. That's healing. Not forgetting what happened, but choosing to build life beyond survival. 2 years after rescue, Liam had grown 3 inches and gained 20 pounds physical transformation, matching emotional growth that therapy and stability had enabled. His grades placed him in top third of his class test scores, suggesting college was realistic goal rather than impossible dream. He joined robotics club where his mechanical aptitude developed through necessity on streets translated into genuine talent for engineering problems requiring creative solutions. Danny had become best friend in traditional sense sleepovers and inside jokes and trust that came from mutual weirdness, accepted rather than judged. But most striking change was invisible to anyone who hadn't known Liam before he smiled regularly, now genuine expression rather than social mask worn to deflect attention. He'd learned to accept help without viewing it as debt requiring repayment. He could receive compliments without immediately discounting them or searching for manipulation beneath kindness. He'd begun to believe that good things could last, that people who said they cared actually meant it, that family built through choice carried same weight as family bound by blood. Marcus watched this transformation with pride that felt paternal in ways that had surprised him initially but now seemed natural extension of commitment made when 300 motorcycles rolled into hospital parking lot because honoring debts was code his club lived by. Late one evening, working side by side in garage on custom bike order, Marcus spoke thoughts that had been forming for months. You know, Sarah and I have been talking about making this permanent, not just custody, but adoption if you're interested. Legal recognition that you're our son, not foster placement with expiration date. No pressure, just want you to know the option exists if you want it. Liam's hands stilled on wrench. He'd been using processing words that carried weight. He wasn't sure how to hold, you do that, even though I'm not actually yours. Marcus's response was immediate, certain. You became ours the moment you threw yourself at kidnappers to save Emma. Everything since has just been paperwork, catching up to reality we've all been living. You're our son in every way that matters. Making it legal would just be acknowledging truth everyone already knows. 3 months later, adoption was finalized in brief courthouse ceremony, attended by immediate family and select club members who'd been present from beginning. Liam Bennett became Liam Kane, name change that felt less like losing identity and more like gaining one that included history before, but wasn't defined solely by loss and trauma. Judge's pronouncement was simple, bureaucratic, but carried emotional weight that had Sarah crying and Marcus's voice rough when he spoke afterward. Welcome to the family officially. Not that anything really changes except the paperwork. But Emma, now 8 and possessing wisdom that seemed beyond her years, corrected him with observation that demonstrated she understood significance others were minimizing. Everything changed. Liam's not alone anymore. That's everything. 5 years after rescue, Liam was 17 and planning for college, SAT scores strong enough that scholarships appeared likely applications, emphasizing both academic achievement and life experience that essay prompts never quite captured adequately. He'd continued therapy on less frequent basis maintenance rather than crisis intervention, processing ongoing challenges that came from carrying trauma. Nobody fully left behind, but learning to integrate into narrative that included joy and connection alongside pain and loss. He'd become youth advocate himself, volunteering with homeless outreach programs, speaking at schools about his experience working with Iron Wolves on community initiatives supporting at-risk children. His perspective, shaped by living both sides of invisibility and visibility, made him effective in ways social workers with degrees but without lived experience couldn't quite match. He could identify kids who were hiding homelessness, could speak their language, could offer hope rooted in authentic transformation rather than theoretical possibility. Memorial to Jennifer Bennett was erected in small cemetery on anniversary of her death, simple stone that Liam had selected with care. Jennifer Bennett, beloved mother, lost but not forgotten. He visited occasionally conversations with women who'd loved him before addiction had stolen her capacity to show that love consistently. Duchen had helped him process complicated grief that included anger and loss and love all tangled together in ways that didn't require resolution, just acknowledgement that humans were complex and relationships even more so. Scout remained constant companion through everything, now elderly dog with graying muzzle and slower movements, but loyalty that had never wavered through 6 years since Allie had brought them together. When veterinarian gently suggested Scout's quality of life was declining, that pain management could only do so much, Liam made decision to let him go peacefully rather than extend suffering from attachment to keeping him present. Marcus sat with him through euthanasia, Scout's final breaths coming, while Liam held him and whispered gratitude for companionship that had sustained him through darkest period when survival had seemed impossible and connection had meant everything. Grief for Scout was profound but different from grief for his mother, because this loss came with closure and choice rather than shock and abandonment. Sarah found Liam in guest house that evening, tears spent, but sadness still heavy. He was good boy, best boy. He saved me as much as I saved him, maybe more. 3 months before high school graduation, Liam was invited to speak at national conference on homelessness panel featuring youth who'd experienced housing insecurity and had perspective that policymakers needed to hear. His speech focused less on his individual story and more on systemic failures that created homelessness epidemic affecting millions. I was lucky. Lucky that I intervened at right moment, that right people noticed that resources existed to help me when circumstances aligned. But luck shouldn't be required for children to access safety and stability. We need systems that work for everyone, not just those fortunate enough to become viral stories or encounter individuals willing to challenge bureaucracy on their behalf. His words were quoted in education policy journals, cited by advocates pushing for reform, but Liam remained grounded by Marcus's reminder that speaking truth to power mattered less than showing up consistently for people who needed help now, rather than waiting for systems to change through political processes moving at glacial pace. Graduation day arrived with mixture of pride and bittersweet recognition that childhood, both the one he'd lost and the one he'd gained, was concluding to make space for adulthood that would bring different challenges requiring different skills. Marcus and Sarah sat in auditorium watching Liam accept diploma. Imamesu beside them at 13 now, Danny and robotics club friends cheering from student section Tank and Wrench, and other club members occupying back rows in leather that stood out among parents wearing business casual. Valedictorian's speech went to student with higher GPA, but principal's special recognition acknowledged Liam's journey with respect that avoided sensationalizing trauma while honoring courage. Liam Kane demonstrates that adversity doesn't define us. Our response to it does. His commitment to helping others avoid suffering, he experienced his willingness to be vulnerable when society teaches young men to hide emotion, his transformation from invisible child to visible advocate. These exemplify what education should cultivate, not just knowledge, but character. College acceptance to Oregon State came with full scholarship engineering program that would put mechanical aptitude developed through necessity to use solving problems at scale. Marcus helped him move into dormitory carrying boxes upstairs while offering advice Liam would remember. You're going to be fine. Better than fine. You've survived things that would break most people. College will be easy compared to what you've already conquered. But adjustment to college proved more complicated than Marcus had predicted. Not because Liam lacked academic capacity, but because independence that came with dormitory living triggered anxiety he hadn't anticipated. Roommate who kept irregular hours reminded him of foster home chaos. Cafeteria food that was technically adequate but lacking care Sarah put into meals made him acutely aware of how much family had provided beyond basic survival needs. Late night studying when campus grew quiet reminded him of Bridge, where silence had meant isolation rather than choice. He called home more frequently than he'd planned conversations with Sarah that centered her rather than burdening her with every minor struggle. But she heard what he wasn't saying. It's okay to miss home. It's okay to find this hard. You're not failing just because transition isn't smooth. Give yourself time to adjust. Thanksgiving break brought him back to Portland, to guest house that remained his room, despite being away at school to family gathered around table, that now included extended members who'd become fixtures through years of showing up consistently. Tank's daughter had been born 3 years ago, toddler, who called Liam uncle, without understanding the terminology wasn't technically accurate. Wrench's grandson was applying to colleges himself, asking Liam's advice about engineering programs. Rita Santos had lost her husband to cancer but found support from club family that demonstrated chosen bonds sustain people through loss that biological family alone couldn't always address. Emma, now 13 and navigating middle school social complexities, pulled Liam aside after dinner with a question that suggested she'd been waiting for a private moment. Do you still have nightmares about that day, about when they grabbed me? Liam's honesty came naturally with her, their bond forged through shared trauma, creating safety for vulnerability. Sometimes, less often now, but they don't control me anymore. I've learned they're memories, not predictions. Your brain trying to process something that already happened, not warning about something that will happen again. She nodded slowly, processing his words. Mine are getting better too. Therapy helps. But also knowing you're okay helps. Like if you survived and you're happy now, then I can survive and be happy too. 7 years after rescue, Liam was 20 and working summer internship at firm, specializing in renewable energy infrastructure, applying engineering knowledge to problems with real-world impact. His supervisor's evaluation noted exceptional problem-solving skills and mentioned what Liam had carefully not highlighted in application. His background provides perspective our team lacks. He sees vulnerabilities others miss, anticipates problems from angles we wouldn't consider. Whatever shaped him made him valuable asset. On anniversary of rescue, Marcus called him back to Portland for gathering he'd mentioned was important, but hadn't elaborated about purpose. Liam arrived to find Memorial Park transformed new pavilion-bearing plaque, in honor of Liam Kane and all who choose courage when others look away. The dedication ceremony was brief, city officials acknowledging collaboration between Iron Wolves MC and local government on youth programs that had served 300 at-risk children in 7 years since rescue had sparked community organizing around protecting vulnerable kids. But moment that mattered most came after official speeches concluded when elderly Korean woman approached Liam with recognition and eyes that suggested she'd been watching his journey from distance. You remember me, Mrs. Holloway? I used to feed pigeons here. Liam's throat tightened with emotion as memory flooded back. You fed me too. Sandwiches. You left them on the bench. You saw me when everyone else looked past me. Her smile was gentle, knowing, I knew you'd be okay. You noticed things, cared about others even when you had nothing. That character doesn't disappear just because circumstances improve. I'm glad you found family. You deserve better than streets gave you. 10 years after rescue, Liam was 22 and graduating with engineering degree, job offer already accepted with firm that specialized in infrastructure supporting homeless services, career that combined technical skills with passion for addressing systemic failures that created housing insecurity. Marcus and Sarah sat in an audience again, this time with grandchild in Sarah's arms, Emma's daughter born when she was 19 and choosing to keep baby despite challenges single parenthood would bring, because her family had taught her that chosen support mattered more than traditional timelines. Emma had become social worker herself, specializing in child protective services, determined to reform system from inside that had failed Liam and countless others. Her perspective, shaped by witnessing both trauma and recovery, made her effective advocate for children navigating bureaucracy, designed theoretically to help, but often causing additional harm through institutional rigidity. At graduation party Marcus hosted at Clubhouse, now in its 4th decade of operation, Liam stood before a gathering of people who'd become family through choice and commitment. 10 years ago, I was an invisible boy sleeping under bridge, believing I'd be alone forever. Then one morning I made a decision that changed everything, not just for me, but for everyone here. Marcus Kane taught me that family isn't blood, it's who shows up. That honor means keeping commitments even when they're hard. That courage is acting when action is needed, not when it's convenient. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But what I've learned since is that being saved isn't passive experience. It's accepting help, working through trauma, showing up for yourself the way others show up for you. It's choosing connection over isolation, even when isolation feels safer. It's believing you're worth investing in when everything in your history suggests otherwise. Every person here has shown me what family means through action, not words. That's the debt I can never fully repay, but I can honor it by showing up for others the way you showed up for me. Tank raised glass and toast. That entire clubhouse echoed to Liam. He was never invisible. We just needed to learn how to see him. 15 years after rescue, Liam was 27 and married to a woman he'd met through advocacy work, Maya, who ran a nonprofit supporting homeless youth and understood his passion for addressing failures that created poverty rather than simply managing its symptoms. They'd welcomed son Jacob, whose arrival had transformed Liam's understanding of Marcus's protective instincts in ways he couldn't have grasped until experiencing fatherhood himself. Marcus, now 53 and transitioning club leadership to younger generation, while remaining involved in community programs that had become his legacy, held his grandson with tenderness that suggested experience had deepened rather than diminished his capacity for love. He looks like you did when you were small, before everything fell apart. Maybe he'll have easier path than you had. That's what we work for, right? Each generation having better chance than the one before. Liam watched his father holding his son, 3 generations connected through choice as much as biology, and felt gratitude for journey that had brought him from bridge to family that spanned chosen and blood bonds without distinguishing between their validity. He'll have what I have now, family that shows up. That's everything. Sarah, now 51 and teaching parenting classes to foster families, had learned from Liam's experience what conventional training couldn't teach, that trauma required patience and consistency, that love wasn't enough without action, demonstrating commitment, that family was verb requiring continuous effort rather than noun existing passively once established. Emma, 21 and still navigating single parenthood while completing social work degree, had become advocate. Marcus was proud of in ways that transcended pride in her survival. She'd transformed trauma into purpose, choosing career that would protect other children from experiencing what she'd barely escaped. On 20-year anniversary of Rescue Memorial Park, held ceremony honoring 2 decades of collaboration between Iron Wolves MC and city programs supporting vulnerable youth. 3,000 children had been served through initiatives sparked by one homeless boy's courage and one biker's commitment to honoring debt that couldn't be reduced to transaction or obligation. Liam stood at podium with gray just beginning to streak his hair, at 32 engineering career, established but advocacy remaining central to identity forged through experience. 20 years ago, I was 12 and invisible, believing I'd die alone under bridge where nobody noticed I existed. Then I chose to act when child needed help, and that choice brought me family I couldn't have imagined. Marcus Kane showed me that honor means keeping commitments even when they're hard. That family is who shows up when you're broken and alone. That courage isn't absence of fear, but action despite it. His voice carried across crowd that included city officials, social workers, teachers, families, and Iron Wolves members spanning 3 generations. But real heroism isn't what happened that morning in Park. Real heroism is what happened next. 300 people deciding that debt to homeless child mattered more than convenience. Marcus and Sarah choosing consistency over time when parenting traumatized kid proved harder than they'd anticipated. Club members showing up for years, not just dramatic rescue, but boring Tuesday afternoons when I needed ride to therapy or help with homework or someone to remind me I mattered. That's heroism. Not one dramatic moment, but 1,000 small choices to keep showing up. He paused, emotion-threatening voice he was working to keep steady. If you're alone right now, if you feel invisible, if you think nobody would notice, if you disappeared, I need you to understand something. 20 years taught me your life has value you can't see yet. Somewhere people exist who will show up if you're brave enough to be seen. Family isn't perfect people with perfect answers. It's imperfect people choosing to stay when leaving would be easier. That's what saved me. Not heroism, but consistency. Not perfection, but commitment. Not blood, but choice to keep showing up even when hard. Tank, now 70 and retired from active club leadership, but maintaining a presence that commanded respect, stood slowly. 20 years ago, we voted to honor debt to kid we didn't know. Best vote this club ever made. Not just for Liam, for all of us. He taught us what really matters: showing up, keeping commitments, choosing connection over convenience. That's code worth living by. Marcus approached Liam after ceremony jacket, showing patches earned through 4 decades with Iron Wolf's presence that had grounded Liam through every challenge that had arisen in 20 years since Park. You know what I'm proudest of? Not that you survived, not that you thrived, that you chose to help others instead of protecting yourself from pain that came from caring. That's character. That's who you always were. We just gave you space to become who you were meant to be. Liam's response came from a place of certainty earned through 2 decades of experiencing what family meant when built on choice rather than obligation. You gave me more than space. You gave me life worth living. Everything I am, everything I've built, everything I'll teach my son about what family means. It started with 300 motorcycles rolling into hospital parking lot because honor mattered more than convenience. That's legacy worth honoring. As sunset painted Memorial Park in gold light that made ordinary moment feel sacred, Liam watched Jacob playing with Emma's daughter, 2 children who'd never know invisibility because their family had learned that showing up mattered more than any single dramatic rescue ever could. Scout's memory remained present in photographs displayed throughout Kane home, a reminder that loyalty and love transcended species and circumstance. Jennifer Bennett's grave received flowers regularly, forgiveness and love coexisting with memory of how addiction had stolen mother he'd needed. But what defined Liam's life wasn't loss or trauma or dramatic rescue that had changed trajectory. What defined him was choice made daily to show up for others, the way family had shown up for him, to see people others overlooked to act when action was needed, rather than waiting for someone else to carry burden that anyone could shoulder if they chose courage over convenience. 20 years after Invisible Boy had chosen visibility, at moment when it mattered most, family forged through choice demonstrated that honor was verb, requiring continuous action, that courage was practice rather than trait, that love built through showing up day after day carried weight blood alone couldn't match. The ride wasn't over. It was just beginning for new generation learning that family wasn't who you started with, but who you chose to stand beside when life demanded you decide what really mattered. And in that choosing, Invisible Boy, who'd believed he'd die alone, had built legacy that would outlive him, proved that every life has value and every person deserves to be seen. Every act of courage matters even when world suggests otherwise. That was truth worth living, by worth teaching Jacob and every child who came after. That was family. That was home. That was love, built not on perfection, but on showing up consistently when others would have looked away.